Morichjhapi. Sunlight is streaming in through an uncurtained window woke Kanai shortly after dawn. A little later, having washed and changed, he went downstairs and tapped on Nilima's door. The voice that answered was uncharacteristically tremulous. ¿Qué? It's me. Can I? Come in. The door's open. Kanai entered to find a bleary-eyed Nilima sitting propped up in bed with a blanket of pillows behind her and a large quilt piled over her legs. There was a cup of tea on the bedside table and next to it a saucer filled with Marie biscuits. No clothes or personal effects were anywhere to be seen while books and files lay stacked everywhere. Under the bed, on the floor, and even in the swell of the mosquito netting. The room was sparsely utilitarian in appearance, with very few furnishings other than the file cabinets and bookcases. But for the presence of a large four-poster bed, it would have been easy to mistake it for an extension of the trust's office. "You're not looking well," said Kanai. "Has a doctor been sent for?" Nilima blew her nose into a handkerchief. "It's just a cold," she said. "Why do I need a doctor to tell me that?" "You shouldn't have come to Canning yesterday," said Kanai. "It was too much for you. You should take better care of your health." Nilima brushed this off with a flick of her hand. "Enough about me," she said. "Sit down over here and tell me how you've been faring. Did you sleep well last night?" "Well enough." "And the packet?" she cried eagerly. "Did you find it?" "Yes, it was exactly where you said it would be." "So then, Bal Torre, tell me," said Nilima. "Were they poems or stories?" Kanai could tell from the expectant tone of her voice that she had already begun to believe that her husband's literary reputation would be posthumously restored by the contents of the package she had found. It pained him to disappoint her, and he tried to let her down as gently as he could. "Actually, it's not what I expected," he said. "I thought I'd find poems, essays, stories, but what I found instead was some kind of journal or diary. It was written in an exercise book, just a common carta, like school children use." "Oh?" Nilima's eyes dimmed and she breathed a sigh of dejection. "And when was it written?" "Does it say?" "Yes," said Kanai. "It was written in 1979. 1979? Nilima was quiet for a moment as she thought this over. "But that was the year of his death. He died in July. Are you sure it was written in that year?" "Yes," said Kanai. "Why should that surprise you?" "I'll tell you why," she said. "Because that was the one year of his life when he did no writing at all. He had retired as headmaster of the Lucy Barry school the year before, and it was a difficult time for him. The school had been his whole life for almost 3 decades, ever since we came to Lucy Barry. His behavior became erratic at this time. As you know, he had a history of mental instability, so it was very worrying for me. He used to disappear for days, and afterwards he wouldn't be able to recall where he had been. He was all in an uproar that year. He was in no state to do any writing. Maybe he had a brief period of lucidity," Kanai said. I have the impression the entire book was written over 1 or 2 days. And do you know the dates? Said Nilima, watching him closely. Yes, said Kanai. He started writing it on the morning of 15th May 1979 in a place called Morichjhapi. Morichjhapi! There was a sudden intake of breath as Nilima said the word. Yes, said Kanai. Tell me what happened there. Morichjhapi, said Nilima, was a tide country island a couple of hours from Lusibari by boat. It fell within a part of the Sundarbans reserved for tiger conservation, but unlike many such islands, it was relatively easily accessible from the mainland. In 1978, a great number of people suddenly appeared in Morichjhapi. In this place where there had been no inhabitants before, there were now thousands almost overnight. Within a matter of weeks, they had cleared the mangroves, built abads, and put up huts. It happened so quickly that in the beginning no one ever knew who these people were. But in time it came to be learned that they were refugees originally from Bangladesh. Some had come to India after partition while others had trickled over later. In Bangladesh they had been among the poorest of rural people, oppressed and exploited by both Muslim communalists and by Hindus of the upper castes. Most of them were Dalits, as we say now, said Nilima. Harijans, as we used to say then. But it was not from Bangladesh that these refugees were fleeing when they came to Morichjhapi. It was from a government resettlement camp in central India. In the years after partition, the authorities had removed the refugees to a place called Dantakaranya, deep in the forests of Madhya Pradesh, hundreds of kilometers from Bengal. They called it resettlement, said Nilima, but people say it was more like a concentration camp or prison. The refugees were surrounded by security forces and forbidden to leave. Those who tried to get away were hunted down. The soil was rocky and the environment was nothing like they had ever known. They could not speak the languages of that area, and the local people treated them as intruders, attacking them with bows, arrows, and other weapons. For many years they put up with these conditions. Then in 1978, some of them organized themselves and broke out of the camp. By train and on foot, they moved eastwards in the hope of settling in the Sundarbans. Morichjhapi was the place they decided on. Earlier that year, Left Front ministry had taken power in West Bengal, and the refugees may have assumed that they would not face much opposition from the state government. But this was a miscalculation. The authorities had declared that Morichjhapi was a protected forest reserve, and they had proved unbending in their determination to evict the settlers. Over a period of about a year, there had been a series of confrontations between the settlers and the government forces. And the final clash, Nilima said, if I recall correctly, was in mid-May of that year in 1979. So do you think Nirmal was there at the time? Kanai stopped to consider another possibility. Or was it perhaps just a fantasy? I don't know, Kanai, Nilima said, looking down at her hands. I really don't know. He became a stranger to me that year. He wouldn't talk to me. He would hide things. It was as if I had become his enemy. Kanai could see that Nilima was close to tears, and his heart went out to her. It must have been very hard for you. It was, she said. I could see that he had developed some kind of obsession with Morichjapi, and I was very uneasy about it. I knew there was going to be trouble, and I just wanted to keep him from harm. Kanai scratched his head. I still don't understand. Why did this cause have so much appeal for him? Nilima's answer was slow in coming. You have to remember, Kanai, she said at length, that as a young man Nirmal was in love with the idea of revolution. Men like that, even when they turn their backs on their party and their comrades, can never let go of the idea. It's a secret God that rules their hearts. It is what makes them come alive. They revel in the danger, the exquisite pain. It is to them what childbirth is to a woman, or war to a mercenary. But these settlers, weren't they revolutionaries? Were they? No, said Nilima, not at all. Their aims were quite straightforward. They just wanted a little land to settle on. But for that they were willing to pit themselves against the government. They were prepared to resist until the end. That was enough. This was the closest Nirmal could ever come to a revolutionary moment. He desperately wanted to be part of it. Perhaps it was his way of delaying the recognition of his age. Kanai was hard put to reconcile the gentle, dhoti-clad man of his memories with this image of a revolutionary. Did you try to reason with him? Yes, of course, Nilima said. But he would say, you've joined the rulers. You've begun to think like them. That's what comes of doing the sort of social work you've been doing all these years. You've lost sight of the important things. She shut her eyes as she recalled the contempt with which her own husband had dismissed her life's work. She turned her head to brush away the tears. We were like two ghosts living in the same house. At the end, he seemed to want only to hurt me. Just think about it, Kanai. Why else would he have insisted on leaving these notes to you and not to me? I don't know what to say. Kanai had assumed that Nirmal had wanted him to have the notebook because he, Kanai, represented a slender connection to the ears of unheeding world. He had not for a moment to consider the possibility that Nirmal had intended to wound Nilima. The idea shocked him. He had always known Nirmal to be eccentric, but he had never thought him to be capable of malice or cruelty, especially to his own wife. Like everyone who knew them, he had always assumed that Nilima and Nirmal were content in their marriage, that theirs was a happy, if unlikely, pairing. He realized now that it was only because Nirmal never left Lusibari that they had been able to sustain this illusion. Thinking of what Nilima had been through all these years, an unfamiliar lump rose in Kanai's throat. Look, he said, rising to his feet. I'll give you that notebook right now. You can keep it or throw it away or do whatever you like. I don't want to have anything more to do with it. No, Kanai, cried Nilima. Sit down. Reaching for his hand, she pulled him back into his chair. Kanai, listen to me. I always did my best to do my duty by Nirmal. It's very important to me that his last wishes are not dishonored. I don't know why he wanted you to have the book. I don't know what's in it. But that's how it must be. Kanai went to sit beside her on the bed. He had been uneasy about broaching the subject of Kusum, but he could see no way around it. Tell me, he said gently, do you think Kusum might have had something to do with it? She flinched at the sound of the name. There were rumors, can I? Yes, I won't deny it. But how did Kusum end up in Morichjhapi? I don't know how it happened, but somehow she did. And did you ever see her while she was there? Kanai said. Nilima nodded. Yes, just once. She came to see me in this very room. She was working at her desk, said Nilima, one morning in 1978 when a nurse came to tell her she had a visitor, someone who claimed to know her. Nilima asked what her name was, but the nurse didn't know. All right, said Nilima. Bring her here. A few minutes later, the door opened to admit a young woman and a child, a boy of 4 or 5. The woman looked to be in her early 20s, but she was dressed in a white sari and there were no bangles on her wrist and no vermilion in her hair. Elsewhere, Nilima would have known immediately she was a widow, but in Lucy Bari, she could not be sure. There was something familiar about the woman, not so much her face as the look in her eye, but Nilima could not remember her name. When the visitor bowed to touch her feet, she said, Tell me now, who are you? Mashima, came the answer. My name is Kusum. Don't you remember me? Kusum! Almost at once Nilima began to scold her. Why didn't you send news, Kusum? Where have you been? Didn't you know we were looking for you? Kusum's answer was to laugh. Mashima, there was too much to tell, more than I could put into a letter. When she stood up, Nilima saw that Kusum had grown into a sturdy, bright-eyed young woman. And who is this boy, Kusum? That's my son, she answered. His name is Fakir Chan Mandal. And his father? His father died, Mashima. I am all he has now. Nilima was glad to see that premature widowhood had not robbed Kusum of her ready laugh. Tell me, Kusum, what brings you here? It was then that Kusum revealed that she was living in Morichjhapi. She had come to Lucy Bari in the hope of persuading Nilima to send medical help for the settlers. Nilima was immediately on her guard. She told her that she would have liked to help, but it was impossible. The government had made it known that it would stop at nothing to evict the settlers. Anyone suspected of helping them was sure to get into trouble. Nilima had the hospital and the women's union to think of. She could not afford to alienate the government. She had to consider the greater good. After half an hour, Kusum left and Nilima never saw her again. So what happened after that? Kanai said. Where did she go? She didn't go anywhere, Kanai. She was killed. Killed? Said Kanai. How? What happened? She died in the massacre, Kanai, Nilima said. The massacre at Morichjhapi. She covered her face with her hands. I'm tired now. I think I'd better rest for a while.